Welcome back for another episode of Errant Adventures, the solo actual play podcast where stories are told at the speed of dice. With me, Steve Morrison, your game master and solo player. Now come on, let's grab the dice and see where our story goes. Welcome back for our final episode of this 1,000-year-old vampire game. So let's jump right back in and start off with our die roll of a d10 and a d6 and see where we go next. Forward 4. 63. How do you provide for your banal material needs? Record an experience about the time this went wrong. Check a skill. So I'm going to mark off new poetry. And I think that Roland owns this bookshop. And he is making do by selling books to people. But he also takes this idea of new poetry that he's been writing. And I think he tries to essentially self-publish a book of poetry. And it almost puts him out of business because there's so much derision about his poetry and about him as a creative, because there's something about the way he writes poetry that feels like a facsimile of modern poetry and not something that is true and authentic. And so he almost loses his bookshop because people just stop coming there for several months because of this response. I released a book of poetry, but it was universally panned by the people who read it as inauthentic. I almost lost the shop and my creative spirit. Staying on the same prompt. How do you avoid the eye of the government? Create a skill based on a memory. Because he owns this bookshop, he has to pay like some sort of taxes. But I think that he has set it up in such a way that it's as if someone else owns it and he is just caretaking it for them. And so he is able to pay the taxes, but is able to avoid kind of notice. So if anyone from the government ever comes by looking for so-and-so who owns the shop, dear Roland can just be like, oh, sorry, I do not know where they are. I send coin off to them, and every once in a while they send me a letter saying that I should do this or I should do that. And so I think in that way he is able to stay under the radar. So I'm going to make a skill called effective bureaucracy. And I think because I built that off of a memory of him kind of having this bookshop and releasing his own like poetry and stuff like that, but he's using that as a way to obscure that he's the one who actually owns the shop. I don't know that I need to make a new experience off of that. Back 3 to 60. Check a skill to avoid arrest as a criminal. What happened? Who was arrested in your place? Create a mortal character if necessary. I mean, is this where we find out that there's tax fraud going on from the bookshop and they come for him? I think that someone is murdered close to the bookshop, and the murder is Roland feeding on this poor fellow. But when people start to question whether or not he was somehow involved, maybe it was someone that he had a rivalry with, who they got into a fight and was seen publicly having a fight, and Roland has no alibi for the time of the murder, so people are starting to look at him, that he manages to cast blame on someone else. And that someone else is Henry, the carter. And that is the person who is arrested. And so we're going to mark off all blood runs red, as I think he is able to plant some of the blood on Henry. So maybe Roland got some blood on his shirt and he plants that in Henry's hovel, and the authorities find it and arrest him. I fed on arrival too close to my shop, and now the authorities think I committed his murder. I was able to frame poor Henry with a bloody shirt. Another 6 and 6, which means we're going to stay right here. Create an innocent mortal character. They were executed for a crime you committed. What hobby were you tinkering with the night they were put to death? Take the skill. It's none of my concern. Well, we already set this up. I don't have to create a mortal character who is innocent. We already have one. That's Henry the Carter. So we're going to take it's none of my concern. It's the night of poor Henry the Carter's execution. And Roland is sitting in his bookshop, a small corner of it, with a blade and a stack of wood. And he's taken up whittling. He can hear the cries as the execution is underway. As he listens to the cries of the people, he's whittling a small cart. Tonight is Henry's execution, but it is no concern of mine. After all, I have trinkets to whittle. Five forward to 65. A possession turns out to have financial value as an antique. Trade your oldest resource for 2 contemporary resources. Well, if we look at our current resources, we have a sword gifted from the Emperor, a ring belonging to someone, a standard of the Imperial Army, a chest of finger bones, and Theodonia's diary. The 3 oldest resources are the sword, the ring, and the standard of the Imperial Army. And I think that I have to consider the amount of time that has passed, and that standard is probably fairly tattered at this point, maybe even moth-eaten. So I'm actually just going to mark that off. So I don't think it's that. Now, I think you could make the argument that the sword would probably be rusty and not as well kept either, but I think that we have tried to keep it as safe as possible throughout the years. So I think that is the thing. So we're going to mark off the sword that was gifted from the Emperor, and we're going to turn that into 2 contemporary resources. So I'm going to make one of them a chest of gold and jewels. And then I'm going to make the second resource a manor estate. Now we need to connect this with a memory. Oh, we've got a lot of full memories. So I think we're going to have to dispose of one and start fresh. A duke took an interest in my ancient sword. I traded it to him for jewels and an estate. 4 forward for 69. Nice. You bond with an ancient enemy character over your shared past, finding in it something more comprehensible than this modern world. Check a skill. You become friends, share a resource, and gain a resource that is shared with you. Interesting. I mean, it has to be Theodonia, because we have a few immortals still in our kind of character lists. We've got Faria, this woman that turned Roland into a vampire all those years ago. And then we've got Wilhelm, who is this kind of sycophantic vampire that Roland created a few hundred years ago. But Theodonia is really the only immortal enemy that we have. So I think that Theodonia comes back into our lives. But I think that she has probably also changed her name at this point. And I think when they meet Roland barely recognizes her, but he does recognize her based on descriptions from the diary that Elsbeth has brought to him. And I think we should probably also clear out that Elsbeth is probably dead at this point, because I think it's probably been another 100 years. I think we're into the 17th century now. So I'm going to mark Elsbeth off of the character list. But the diary that Elsbeth brought to him guided Roland to some memory of Theodonia. And so when they meet, I think it's clear that she still remembers him, and he feels this strong connection with her. I think that he is going to share the manor estate with her. And is she going to share the amulet? Because she stole it from him. I think that's interesting. So let's return that and just make a note of it, that it is shared with Sylvia. And so, yes, she introduces herself as Sylvia, this woman, but there's this connection, this frisson between them. And I think that Roland knows that this is the woman who wrote the diary. This is the woman to whom he was wed hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years ago, in fact. And I think that they reminisce over the years, and he hears about all of the torments and tribulations that Sylvia endured to get to this place as well. And they fall into this moment together, letting the anger of the past dissipate, almost like they have this conversation of why were we fighting? Why were we enemies again? So I'm going to connect that to the memory that involved Elsbeth bringing the diary. So that will fill up that memory. So we will have to move it or change it or something like that in the future. But for now, I think I'm just going to connect it to that. She returned, the woman I once knew, now called Sylvia. She takes up residence with me in my estate, and her return fills an emptiness I had not realized was there. Oh, I need to check a skill. So my current skills are courage in the face of charging spears, effective bureaucracy. It's none of my concern. Those are some interesting... I think it's maybe courage in the face of charging spears, because he remembers her. He remembers her as this person that captured him, stole his amulet and his diary of memories. And so I think when she first appears, there is some concern about how this is going to go. So instead of fighting or running away, he stands in the face of that fear, and they come out of it better off. 7 forward. 76. A government captures you, knowing you for what you are. What do they do with you? The game is over. Well, this is an interesting twist, because Roland now does have that Moorish amulet back as part of their resources. And going back to that prompt, it says, if you still have it when you achieve any game-ending result, you may rewrite the ending as you like. So Roland is living the high life in this estate. And it's almost to the year, 1,000 years since he was transformed into this creature. In fact, it is 1635, and Charles I is King of England. Roland and Sylvia have been reunited and living in this estate for 20 years. They've fallen into a rhythm of sneaking out across the countryside, feeding, and then slipping back into the estate and reveling in what little pleasures of the flesh that remain to creatures who are 1,000 years old. And then, one evening, a troop of soldiers marches up to the gate, banging on the door, And the servants allow them entrance, because one would not deny the Lord Chancellor, Thomas Coventry, entrance to the estate. And Roland and Sylvia are taken unawares as they are in the midst of these revelries of the flesh. Blood of their latest victims still on their faces and hands. The two of them, these ancient creatures, fight and struggle to resist. But there are too many of these mortal soldiers, pinning them down, binding them, and dragging them from the grounds of their estate. Lord Coventry has, for a few years now, suspected this small estate near Glastonbury of being host to creatures of the devil. And now, having captured these creatures, he has them at his mercy. They are faced with tortures and torments that no mortal could survive. And yet, Roland and Sylvia carry through it. Finally, Lord Coventry, being satisfied that these two beings are not of this world, puts them to the fire to send them back to their Lord Devil. And so their bodies are burned as they scream and curse in pain and agony till their immortal bodies are reduced to ashes. And those ashes are taken and scattered to the winds. The years pass, and the estate that they owned passes into the hands of a noble family. And one of them finds this small amulet buried at the bottom of a chest in the attic. A young woman, she pulls it out and she looks at it, and it hums with a strange resonance. And being intrigued by it, she puts it on, and almost for an instant, she feels as though there's a presence in the room with her. A man, a woman, their hands joined. She feels something powerful, an emotion unlike anything that she's ever felt before, and it frightens her. So she takes off the amulet, she puts it in a small box, and hides it away in the dark. Will it be found again? Will it be remembered? Will the spirits of Laonicus Stratioticus and Theodonia ever be released from it? That is not a memory I have to tell. Thanks for listening to Errant Adventures. If you enjoyed the show, please spread the word. And if you want to support the show directly, leave me a review or support me on Patreon at patreon.com/errantadventures. You can also buy me a coffee at ko-fi.com/errantadventures. If you want to interact with me, my handle on all the socials is @errantsolopod, or you can email me at errantsolopod@gmail.com. I also post short fiction and campaign-related materials on my website, errantadventurespod.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the deep, liars.